Hello, I'm Ben, DivKid, and welcome to this video on Ripsaw from Acid Rain Technology, a 4-voice 56 oscillator stereo super swarm. Here's what's to come in the video. This video is sponsored by Acid Rain Technology. So back in 2019, Acid Rain Technology released a module called the Chainsaw, a 3-voice Super Saw and Supersquare stereo oscillator with 21 internal oscillators. I'll link that video below if you'd like to check it out, but fast forward to 2025, and they've made a follow-up called Ripsaw. Ripsaw is 6 HP, and it's based on this same stereo output Super Saw and Supersquare wave shaping idea. It has detune controls, and new for the Ripsaw is a 4th voice and a new shift effect which gives hard sync sounds, and we also have a new LED note display to show the note that you're tuned to. And it's worth noting up front in the video that I film these videos with a lot of light, and the brushed texture to the panel is picking up and reflecting a lot of that light, making it look a little greyed out at points. It is a black panel, just so you're aware. So going down the panel here, we have the mentioned display here to show the note that we're tuned to, and turning that encoder will show you the note, and pushing the encoder you go into a cent offset from 0 to 99 if you'd like to fine tune, and pushing that goes back to the note display. And that feels like a sophisticated and simple way to tune your oscillators. We then have shape that morphs from a saw wave through to a more hollow square-like tone, and that has a CV input labeled shape. Spread is then the detune control. Each voice has 7 oscillators which are spread around the stereo image, and those all detune from each other, and that also has a CV input. Shift then controls the pitch of additional hard sync oscillators, and that too has a CV input. Each of the 4 voices has an individual volt per octave input, and these normal together for simple monophonic or duophonic playing, and with 4 voices, each with 7 oscillators, that's 28 oscillators that we listen to on the left and right outputs. Add in the additional hard sync oscillators on the shift control, which is 1 per oscillator that we actually hear at the output, and that's 56 oscillators internally. Acid Rain Technology have said Ripsaw is the first firmware to be released for their 6 HP hardware platform called Hex, so I'm excited to see what's coming from them in the future. Throughout the video, we'll explore the sounds and controls alongside some creative ways to use the Ripsaw and what it offers, and I also asked Patreon supporters in the DivKid Discord community what they'd like to see and how they'd like to see us make use of 4 volt per octave inputs. So you'll see and hear requests and suggestions from them for different approaches and setups for making polyphonic patches with chords, overlapping phasing sequences, a musical fugue. A side note, there's a bonus Patreon exclusive video on how to sequence a musical fugue, and the patches jump around lots of musical styles as always. Thanks to everyone that supports and made suggestions. The patches are on screen and down in the description for you to skip around. So let's dive in. So just to get a kind of broad feel for the tone, I thought I'd just let this drone just straight stereo out into the mixer with 3 full range LFOs to the shape, spread and shift. So sometimes you just need to get lost in a sound and a chord progression. And by Moonbase Alpha, a patron supporter requesting to see Ripsaw with Klang, I've just found this sound and chord progression that I'm just utterly lost in. There's a huge Bop and Steve reverb. I'll remove that from the mix. And this is the 4 CV outputs from Klang, a chord sequencer, coming into the 4 voices here. Currently no modulation. Big, rich super saws into the ST font stereo filter. For a bit of added spice and flavour, I'm playing some VCAs as attenuators down here. The blue trace modulates the shape, so as I turn this up, we're sequencing from saw to more hollow square tones. And as I turn this fader up, this is the green trace going to shift, moving around those hard sync tones. So I can play on these faders, some interesting stepped modulation. Now here I'm using Ripsaw as a Supersquare chord stab. Just going to play around for a moment and then I'll break it down. So here's the sound of Ripsaw just straight into the mixer, not going through anything else, and it's not modulated either. All of the vocal per octaves here are playing the same sequence from my Eloquencer, but I'm using different offset generators. You could use precision adders, transposer modules to create a chord tone. On the Beach chalkboard here, I'm going to first go down an octave. One output here, the through red cable, is my root note, so I'm going to come down an octave into the second one. And let's just remove that sync and a bit of the detune. I'm going to come up an octave on the next one. And then over on the VPME T43 here, I'm going to come up 3 semitones for a minor third. And there we have this octave spread and the third, giving this big chord tone. The spread, of course, detunes, and it's the shift here, this syncing. It really opens up this sound. Now I have an 8th note envelope, so just bum 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 pulsing away. I'm going to patch into shift. It's a little bit heavy-handed on the actual dry output, but as this then comes into the Q pass, which I'll unmute now, this works really well. Remove the effects. I'm mixing my green trace main envelope here, just playing along with my sequence, and a blue trace quarter note that's been inverted in manic here in a VCA. The yellow trace is the output, so I'm creating a sidechain within my envelope by inverted quarter note modulating against my main envelope. Bit of a weird looking trace there in yellow is the result, but that's what modulates the VCA and filter, among some other modulation. And then just a little bit of wet level from Bop and Steve. And I can play around with blending in the dry sound and using that as a performative tool, muting that and unmuting the drums. The drums here are the quad drum, sequencing from the Eloquencer. Stepped random modulation of Q pass, it's the low pass output here. Just 4 voices of just big, rich supersaw chords. I'm using the harmonic here to take a keyboard voltage, monophonic keyboard voltage, and to give me root 3rd, 5th and 7th. Tons of effects on from Bop and Steve, which we can lose. It's just another way to generate chords to take advantage of those 4-volt per octave inputs, and the options to be polyphonic, to create chords. I can play around on the harmony with different voicings, and you could use anything that will create harmonies and chords and extra volt per octaves to drive this. It's a very simple example. With the VCA and filter, lots of drive in the filter. It works really well in this context. So here we'll take a look at shift, which is new to Ripsaw compared to the old chainsaw that this kind of builds upon. And shift controls the tuning relationship with some hard sync with an additional 7 oscillators that sync the other oscillators across these voices. This is into data and just straight into the mixer with no over processing or anything in the signal path. So with a little bit of spread for some motion and shaping across this more hollow, square-like tone. You can hear these hard sync relationships. So let's take a look at modulating it. We'll go supersaw-like. And let's take an LFO straight into shift. Square, a bit less spread. Let's try, say, an envelope. Could do, say, a step sequence instead. And this is really nice for kind of creating little riffs and hooks and patterns without actually any pitch sequencing involved. Adding some pitch sequencing then gets really interesting. So let's build up a patch where we kind of sequence shift tone as the main kind of modulation hook in the patch. So here's that same idea of sequencing shift tones, but through a VCA and filter, just to create a sequence in a normal kind of musical pattern. Removing this sequencing, and let's take spread right down as well. got perfectly normal synth tone, but sequencing shift. And I can show you that sequence on data. So this is the sequence coming in. Again, if I remove it, let's get a more spread, Supersquare-like sound. And then one more time, sequence those shift sync tones. So it's a really handy additional tonal parameter on the Ripsaw. So I asked my Patreon supporters over on the DivKid Discord community what they'd like to see in terms of how I articulate 4-volt per octave voices here. How do I make chords? How do we sequence them? How do we do interesting things when presented with 4-volt per octave inputs? And Gus and Dries said that I should do some phased sequencing. Sequences where maybe one is 16 steps, another is 15, 14 and 13, so that we get these overlapping kind of Reich style phasing patterns. And that's exactly what's happening here. If I pause the sequence and then play the sequence, you'll notice it plays up to the first 13 steps, and then that's where they start to evolve. And if you watch these playheads on these top 4 sequences here, so here we're just listening to Ripsaw straight into the mixer in stereo. And let's stop and start this sequence again. Again, watching these playheads, and you'll hear this phase, a 16, 15, 14 and 13 step sequence. It's exactly the same sequence. That 16 step sequence was copied and then a step removed from the end of the pattern. It's such a beautiful evolution, this kind of Steve Reich-esque phasing sequences. And even just as a plain saw or square-like tone, I think it sounds really beautiful out of the Ripsaw. And just to keep things interesting, because this becomes one kind of like homogenized, very beautiful but kind of musical mush, beautiful mush. Every 16 steps, so on a much divided down sequence, I have a transposition here that will just come from a root, up a fifth and back down again, just to kind of collectively take this phased sequencing set of 4 voices and just move them up and down a little more slowly. And I'll start that again so you can hear how that evolves from the wall being the same at the start. So here's all of this sound that you've been listening to in 2 low pass gates, one for the left and right sides. Again, let's go from the beginning. And some big shimmery effects wash in the background. Thanks to Dries for his suggestion of some phase sequencing. So with this patch, I was kind of on the hunt to create different sounds, not just super squares or super saws, but maybe a much cleaner kind of like sine cloud or something like that, and then to do something else with it, and I thought of folding. And the idea of a clean sine cloud has well and truly gone out of the window with this utter filth that the Q-Pass and Manic is creating from the Ripsaw. Now let me break it down and we'll build back up to the patch. So the patch here is Ripsaw coming out in stereo into the Q-Pass. I'll open that fully. Stereo low pass out into Manic, and I've set Manic to just be a clean VCA, so we can think of this as just hearing the raw output. And my thinking was, if I filter down this waveform, I'll get a much cleaner kind of sine cloud. I have the tracking on the filter, the frequency input, a volt per octave input, playing the same sequence so that the pitch of the input is relative to the frequency of the filter and more consistent in tone. And then I thought, well, let's fold it. So I'll kick Manic here into some folding. And I added some 16th notes, just kind of chugging away on my envelopes here to modulate the level of the fold. With this interesting stereo image between the detuning and the stereo spread of the Ripsaw, and the different folders here created this kind of enhanced stereo image. Going up an octave on one voice and down on another. Just sounds great, super kind of chuggy and distorted, really nasty filth. And finally, with how filthy this gets, which with an already really rich wave, then being folded to death, it gets super noisy. But a little bit of that's quite fun, so I have an envelope pattern here to filter cut off. So this is stereo out of Ripsaw, set to be a square, into Q-Pass, filtered down with a frequency envelope for the filter, into Manic, that's just churning away with a 16th note envelope, folding it. Now finally, octave down and up again on those two voices. And you could be soundtracking some real demon-slaying, hellish game soundtrack with that kind of sound. So in the spirit of showing as many interesting ways of controlling the 4-volt per octave voice inputs here I'm using MIDI with the MIDI thing too. This could be from a computer or a laptop, or it could be from a keyboard. I don't play keyboard that well, but what I do like doing is playing in keyboard note information and having that be articulated, rhythmically modulated, and all the note and rhythm information be part of a modular system. I'll play for one moment, and then I'll get into what's going on. So here's my backing beat coming from the quad drum here, in stereo to my mix. Now the main layer is the stereo outputs from Ripsaw here into the ST font. I'm using this VCA with an envelope to duck around the kick, that's what's making it pump. I have a 16th note envelope to the cutoff, an envelope to the offset on the right side, so with a little bit of sway and stereo movement. And then some stepped random into the volt per octave, just to get this kind of dancing around rhythmically against this shuffled sequencing. And what's quite nice here, using the MIDI thing too for the 4-volt per octave outputs, I'm not using any of the gates, any of the velocity, just straight 4-volt per octaves. It just holds the previous chord, so I can play through a kind of chord progression. And have that all play in time and be rhythmic and exciting in that ST font. Have the mod wheel to the filter cutoff. So let's bring that reverb back in. Here it is turned up. You can listen for that in the background of the mix. And the drums again. So this patch came from trying to negatively offset the Ripsaw down into sub-audio LFO modulation ranges. Now this bottoms out at that lowest tuning, that lowest C that you can scroll to there, so you can't really get down into LFO tunings. But it does do a really nice rumbly, low audio on the edge of sub-audio modulation. So this is an external oscillator coming into Procyon here. Tons of resonance, loads of drive and character, And here's the output of Ripsaw modulating that filter's cutoff. It's really evolving low garbly, turkey gobbling like modulation source. Now sequencing both the oscillator that's coming into the filter and the filter's cutoff with volt per octave and Ripsaw. And let's just back off and attenuate Ripsaw's modulation for a moment. I'm going to modulate the filter with an envelope. Let's add a bit of that kind of grumble. I think low levels of Ripsaw as a modulator is really fascinating. It's just really growling. So bouncing from taking this as low as it will go to tuning it as high as it will go. So I know the root of my sequencing here, if I just pull it out, is tuned to a G. This is a C, so it should work as a fourth. And indeed, this works as a modulator. Without any spread, it's just like a static audiorate oscillator, but as I add a little bit of spread, we get this really wonderful evolution of the modulation, because that wave is shifting. And as I say, I know the note coming into this now is a G. Let's tune this to a G. It's a really nice locked in, but really complex tone. And I'll get my sequencing happening on my input oscillator again. Which works really well. But if I also sequence the Ripsaw, I get overtones that are tracking. And that works incredibly well. So in both of those patches, as low as it will go and as high as it will go, definitely try modulating things with Ripsaw. I think the results are really good. So with this many super saws and this much potential for detune, it's only right that we make a thick Reese bass, kind of jungle D&B, super wide detuned bass. Now the drums, I've got some sampled and synthesized drums and some chopped up breaks. And then we have Ripsaw into the ST font here. I have an envelope playing every time a kick plays with a little bit of inverted frequency modulation. You can just hear that kind of duck out of the way. And you just want low tunings, widespread. And it's kind of hiding all this filth, width, detune in a low pass filter. So again, asking Patreon supporters in the DivKid Discord community what they'd like to see, Isaac the Great, who you may know as Toadstool Tech, asked me to do a fugue, and I'd thought about the Fugue Machine iPad app with 4 different sequences running the same pattern but at different timings, running forwards or backwards, and that's what's led to this patch. I'll go through the sounds in a moment, but if I mute the filtered kind of nice affected layers, if I pull the cables here, here's the main sequence, and I have some LFOs, one attenuated into spread and another into shape, just for the sound to evolve a bit here. And this is the direct Ripsaw out. So all voices playing the main sequence, and then the same 5-step pattern, instead of just running forwards, it runs pendulum, forwards and back. the sequence running forward but divided by 6, so it's running at a slower clock rate. You can hear that sustained note that creates. And then divided by 9, so even slower. Again, the exact same 5-step sequence, running even slower. And because this is like a 5-step arpeggio, it's this one kind of harmonious, nice sequence, nothing is clashing too much. If I then transpose a longer sequencer length, you'll see these move up and the whole pitch will rise up and down. And it creates this longer kind of overall like chord progression like sequence. So this in stereo comes into both the Procyon filter and the Q pass. We'll look at the Procyon first, that's the simplest. Playing 8th notes, I just have a rising and falling envelope here from Fuji, just making that sound pulse. And you can hear the note changes kind of bedded underneath. The filtering and distortion and VCA here. And then the Q pass has lots of probability, playing an envelope to its VCA, so the notes kind of chop in and out randomly. And there's lots of stepped random voltages to resonance, filter cutoff, and the spread of those different filter peaks. And that bandpass out then comes into Bop and Steve for some effects. So we have steady pulse, and then random bandpass movement. Now here I'm turning Ripsaw into some percussion, or rather into a noise generator that with an envelope and a VCA has been turned into percussion. Over on the DivKid Discord, JJB asked me to explore some feedback. So here's Ripsaw, straight into the mixer, and by using stacking cables to patch the outputs back to the inputs, and I found that the volt per octave and the shift are most responsive to audiorate modulation, so they make most sense for feedback here. Let's feedback the output back into shift modulation. Tune down. We get a nice amount of grit. Let's try into volt per octave, and this will normal across all of them. No, it's not happy. And I'm using the sliders here as attenuation. And it was this fuzzy, garbling kind of sound that made me want to tune it up higher, add a load of spread. And get into these screaming kind of noise tones. Feedback to shift as well. And this is great for sound design. And it can work really well for percussion. So adding an envelope to the VCA that the sound is in my mixer. Some probability sequencing here, or rather steps with lower probabilities, so it's random. And we can tune in and dial in, with that feedback still present, a range of percussion sounds. Going to beats 2 and 4, bits for longer envelope. This works as a kind of snare or clap, so bringing in the kick and hi-hat from the quad drum. So that's patching the outputs through a VCA, just to use sliders as attenuation. Patching that back to volt per octave and shift for some feedback, turning the Ripsaw into a stereo noise machine, and then ultimately making percussion with it. So here we're exploring audiorate modulation. Audiorate shift modulation in this case, but we'll also take a look at FM, frequency modulation. Now this is coming into a low pass gate with a simple sequence, just to kind of set this in a kind of typical kind of West Coast patch. One thing I kind of wanted to highlight first here is that if you just turn spread up and down again, these oscillators will spread and then stall where they are when the spread comes back down. You can use that as a mechanism to kind of hunt for new tones. And you can hear the different sounds and see the wave shapes. Let's find something sort of triangle-like there. And then if I listen to my modulator, which is this sine wave from a basic VCO here, here they are together. In tune, just slightly detuned, which is a nice place to be. Now let's modulate shift with this sine wave. It's a really nice audiorate modulation, it's super crunchy. If we go into the volt per octave, this will give us FM. And I have the depth of modulation here, just on this VCA. And balancing the depth of modulation and the tuning can take us to some really gnarly, aggressive FM tones. At this point, I'd like to sequence the oscillator and the FM, and you may think, well, plug the FM into 1 volt per octave inputs and then sequence the others. But the channel, the voice that this is going into providing FM, then won't play the pitch sequence. So I need to mix this externally in a similar way how you'd mix an FM input and a volt per octave input to one oscillator. We need to mix this together before it comes in. So I'll patch the FM to a precision adder that's just off screen. That's going to add with my volt per octave signal. And then this becomes a volt per octave signal. It's also going to the modulator so it tracks. So this is now volt per octave and the FM. If I turn this down and unmute it, it's just the volt per octave signal here. And then you'll see on this slider just at the bottom of the screen, I'll raise the depth of modulation. And I'm just looking for something semi-stable, and then I'll fine tune it. There we go. That depth of modulation suits. Bit gritty and grainy. This modulates up to about 500 Hz, so it is limited. But as you can hear, you can get these really aggressive FM tones. Maybe too aggressive, but once they're in a low-pass gate, some notes are quite stable, some are more aggressive, wonky, not quite tracking as well. Now if I keep this to just the volt per octave signal, removing the audiorate modulation, I'll take my audiorate signal, controlled by the depth here on this VCA, and patch back into shift. It's a nice kind of distortion effect. I think it works better in shift than FM mixed into the volt per octave. If you've got this far in the video, drop a rip sync in the comments. How would you use 4 volt per octave inputs in your system? Thanks for watching. Head to patreon.com/DivKid to support what I do, access exclusives, and to join the community. See you next time. Bye.